This documentary is based on historical records, economic data, and academic research. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many believed it happened suddenly. It did not. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was not a single event. It was the final stage of a long structural decline. Political, economic, and systemic. To understand the collapse, we must first understand the system. The Soviet Union was built on centralized planning. Production targets were determined by state committees. Prices were fixed. Private ownership of major industries was eliminated. In theory, this system aimed to eliminate inequality and ensure stability. For a time, it worked. During the mid-20th century, the Soviet Union industrialized rapidly. It became a superpower. It defeated Nazi Germany. It launched the first satellite into space. But strength on the surface does not always mean stability underneath. The core weakness of the Soviet system was inefficiency hidden by control. In a market economy, prices signal scarcity. In a command economy, signals are replaced by orders. Factories were rewarded for meeting quotas, not for quality. Managers often inflated numbers. Production focused on volume, not usefulness. This created what economists call soft budget constraints. Failing enterprises were rarely allowed to collapse. Losses were absorbed by the state. Innovation slowed. By the 1970s, growth was declining. Technological progress lagged behind the West. Consumer goods were scarce. Queues became normal. But the system survived because oil revenues masked the problem. In the 1970s, high global oil prices brought massive income. The Soviet Union exported energy and used that revenue to maintain stability. Instead of reforming the system, leaders postponed difficult decisions. Then came the 1980s. Oil prices fell, economic stagnation deepened, military spending remained high due to Cold War pressures. The Soviet Union was spending heavily to compete with the United States in arms development, space programs, and global influence. An economy already inefficient now faced external pressure. And here is where structural failure became visible. The state could control production. It could control prices. It could control information. But it could not control economic reality forever. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary. He understood that reform was necessary. He introduced two major policies: perestroika, restructuring the economy; glasnost, increasing openness and transparency. The intention was to save the system. The result was the opposite. Perestroika disrupted central planning but did not fully create a market. State control weakened, but private mechanisms were incomplete. This created chaos rather than efficiency. Glasnost allowed public criticism, information about corruption, past repression, and economic problems became visible. Trust in the system declined. When an authoritarian system opens politically before stabilizing economically, pressure multiplies. National republics within the Soviet Union, Ukraine, the Baltic states, Georgia, and others began demanding sovereignty. The Soviet Union was not a homogeneous nation. It was a multi-ethnic federation held together by central authority. When that authority weakened, fragmentation accelerated. Another factor often overlooked is demographic and generational change. The population of the 1980s was not the population of the 1940s. War generation discipline had faded. Younger citizens were exposed to Western media, music, and lifestyle through unofficial channels. Expectations changed. The system did not. By 1990, shortages intensified. Shops were empty. Inflation rose. Public confidence collapsed. In August 1991, hardline officials attempted a coup against Gorbachev. The coup failed, but the failure destroyed the last illusion of unity. Republics began declaring independence. By December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. No major war. No foreign invasion. A superpower collapsed largely from internal structural weakness. The lesson is not ideological, it is structural. Systems built on rigid control can appear stable for decades. But if feedback mechanisms are suppressed, problems accumulate silently. When reform finally comes, it often arrives too late. The Soviet collapse was not caused by a single leader, not by a single reform, not by a single economic crisis. It was the result of accumulated inefficiencies, delayed adaptation, and systemic rigidity. Technology alone cannot save a weak structure. Military power cannot compensate for economic stagnation. Control cannot replace flexibility indefinitely. History shows a consistent pattern. When systems cannot adapt, they eventually fracture. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it was poor. It collapsed because it could not reform without destabilizing itself. That is the real story behind the fall, and it remains relevant far beyond 1991. December 25th, 1991. For many, it's Christmas Day. But in Moscow, a different kind of history was unfolding. The red flag with the hammer and sickle, a symbol of the Soviet Union for over 70 years, was lowered from the Kremlin for the very last time. The end of an empire. But what came next? We often talk about the Cold War ending, about political victories and failures. But today, we're going beyond the headlines. We're going to explore the human story, the profound social shockwaves that rippled through the lives of 293 million people when their country simply vanished. This is the story of what happened after the fall. When we think about why the Soviet Union collapsed, we often picture a grand showdown between superpowers. Ronald Reagan's tear down this wall, and the immense pressure of the arms race. And yes, external pressures were a huge factor. The US strategy of military and economic competition certainly strained the Soviet system to its breaking point. But to truly understand the collapse, we have to look inside. The story isn't just about Washington versus Moscow. It's also about a system crumbling from within. One of the most powerful and often overlooked external factors wasn't a weapon or a policy, but an idea, the allure of the West. Through smuggled films, music, and even jeans, an image of Western life, one of freedom, consumer choice, and prosperity seeped through the Iron Curtain. 4 generations raised on promises of a communist utopia that never quite arrived. This vision was incredibly potent. It created a deep-seated desire for something more, something different from the long queues and state-controlled everything. This wasn't a government plot. It was a cultural gravitational pull that the rigid Soviet system just couldn't compete with. Another critical internal factor was the rise of nationalism. The Soviet Union wasn't just Russia. It was a forced union of 15 distinct republics, each with its own language, culture, and history. From the Baltics to Central Asia, decades of Soviet rule had suppressed these identities, but never extinguished them. As the central government in Moscow weakened under Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika openness, and long-simmering national feelings boiled over, people in Lithuania, Georgia, Ukraine, and elsewhere began to see a future, not as Soviets, but as independent nations. The demand for sovereignty became an unstoppable force, tearing the Union apart from the inside out. And then there was the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. This wasn't just an industrial accident. It was a catastrophic failure of the entire Soviet system. The initial cover-up, the slow response, the blatant disregard for human life. It exposed the incompetence and moral bankruptcy of the state in a way nothing else could. For millions, trust in the government evaporated overnight. Chernobyl became a terrifying symbol of a system that was not only inefficient, but dangerously broken. It supercharged the environmental and anti-nuclear movements, which quickly grew into broader movements for political change. So when the Union officially dissolved in December 1991, it wasn't a sudden event, but the final crack in a structure that had been rotting for years. For the ordinary citizen, the immediate aftermath was pure chaos. Imagine waking up one day and your country, your currency, your passport, and everything you understood about your society is gone. This was the reality. The first and most brutal shock was economic. The transition from a planned communist economy to free market capitalism was a disaster for most people. This shock therapy, as it was called, led to hyperinflation. People's life savings, stored in rubles, became worthless almost overnight. State-owned factories, which had employed entire towns for generations, closed down, leading to mass unemployment. A new class of oligarchs emerged, snapping up state assets for pennies on the dollar, while doctors, engineers, and teachers were suddenly left selling their possessions on the street just to buy food. The social safety net, which for all its flaws had provided basic stability, completely disappeared. This economic collapse created a massive social crisis. Life expectancy for men in Russia plummeted. Public health systems crumbled. Crime rates soared as organized mafias filled the power vacuum left by the state. There was a profound sense of disorientation and loss. People had been raised with a specific identities. They were Soviet citizens, builders of communism. Suddenly, that identity was declared a failure. What were they now? What was their history? There was a deep psychological wound, a loss of purpose and national pride that led to widespread despair. But in the midst of this chaos, there was also an explosion of freedom. For the first time, people could speak their minds without fear of the KGB. They could travel, start their own businesses, read whatever they wanted, and vote in elections. A vibrant civil society began to emerge from the rubble. New art, music, and literature flourished in this newfound atmosphere of openness. For many, especially the young, it was a time of immense hope and possibility, a chance to build a new country from scratch, free from the ideological chains of the past. The 1990s were this incredible, contradictory decade of both immense suffering and exhilarating freedom, often experienced by the very same people at the very same time. Looking back, the collapse of the Soviet Union teaches us a powerful lesson. It shows that empires can fall not just from external attack, but from internal decay, from a loss of faith, from their own people. It reminds us that history isn't just about leaders and treaties. It's about the everyday lives of ordinary people caught in the tides of extraordinary change. The story of the post-Soviet world is a complex tapestry of tragedy and hope, of loss and rebirth. Understanding that human dimension is the key to understanding one of the most pivotal events of the 20th century. Thanks for watching. If you found this perspective on history interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world.